Hi, my name is Marcia and I'm a PBS NewsHour special correspondent and a Pulitzer grantee. I've just returned from Honduras, where I produced a 4-part series for NewsHour and NewsHour Weekend on the situation in Honduras. And the project really came to be when I was watching all of the coverage of the caravans that were marching across Central America last fall, the fall of 2018. And in all of the discussion of what people were fleeing, families seeking asylum, people fleeing violence, and the vitriolic debate on immigration that ensued here in the United States, I found that there were only a handful of reports, television reports, that were actually shot on the ground in Honduras. So this is what I set out to do. And I thought about the questions that people were asking me when I told them that I was going to Honduras. And the questions were, what is life like there? What are they fleeing? What is the violence like? What happens to the people who are deported? And who's really behind these caravans? Who's funding these caravans? Who's backing these caravans? And what I found was really no one was. These are groups of people who are desperate, and they at very short notice will throw some food, some medicine, a coat or two into a bag and just set off. We were there when one of the caravans left, and shortly thereafter it started raining. And you're talking about families who are just walking down the highway, following the crowd. They've got 2 kids in a grocery cart with a wonky wheel. It's pouring down rain, and this is day 1 of a brutal journey for which they have no guarantee that they'll actually reach the United States, that they'll be able to cross into the United States. But they are desperate. And why are they desperate? They're fleeing rampant violence. They're fleeing extortion by local gangs. They're fleeing a government that on one hand can be described as corrupt and on another hand can be described as inept. They do not feel protected. They're also fleeing extreme poverty. And what happens to the people who are deported? If they're fleeing threats by local gangs, they return to those exact same threats. If they're fleeing extreme poverty, they go back to a way of life where they're struggling to feed their families. There is aid that is going to Honduras, aid from the United States and other sources, but in large part this aid is funneled towards security institutions. And security institutions in Honduras, at its best, is a bit misguided in its attempts to better communities, and at its worst actually fights against the communities. People do not trust the police there. We also looked at the effects of climate change on the dry corridor, the rural communities that are really struggling to survive because of extreme weather and drought. And their solution is, after generations of living off the land, of just having to pack their bags and head north. Now, these stories that we told certainly don't reflect every migrant that we came across or every migrant that tries to cross, but for most of the people that we met, this is the reality. They're fleeing violence, they're fleeing extortion, they're fleeing corruption, and they're fleeing a place where they do not feel protected. And whether the solution is open borders or pressuring the Honduran government to end corruption and impunity, or channeling aid in a more pinpointed direction to create better economic opportunities. None of this was for us to say. Our job was to go to Honduras and shed a light on the problems that are forcing people to flee. And those problems are real.